Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The room felt alive with chatter, voices bouncing off the steel walls, filling the air with the constant hum of authority and urgency. Maps were unrolled, markers squeaked against laminated surfaces, laptops glowed with lines of code and surveillance images. The smell of strong coffee clung to the air, thick and bitter. Boots scuffed against concrete, arms gestured sharply, and voices carried weight, but hers did not. She sat there, quiet, spine straight, hands folded over the folder in front of her. Her eyes scanned the terrain on the projector, every curve of the ridgeline, every faint gray marking of a possible trail. She had already traced those routes a dozen times in her head. She knew where the wind would push, where shadows would fall by midnight, where the ground dipped just enough for cover. But no one asked her. Captain Alvarez spoke with a confidence that filled the room, dragging red marker lines across the map as though he alone could carve strategy into the earth. Lieutenant Morris chimed in with fast, eager suggestions, too loud, too certain. Even a fresh recruit, barely patched into the unit, leaned forward with excitement, tapping his finger at a point on the screen as though his thought might hold more weight than her silence. She wondered if any of them saw her, really saw her. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it wasn't ignorance, it wasn't fear, it was choice. Silence, she had long ago learned, was not weakness, it was restraint, it was patience, it was the gathering of strength before release. But tonight her silence felt heavier, not tactical, not professional, but personal. The word had been spoken, dropped into the middle of the briefing like a stone thrown into water. Hostages. And just like that, she wasn't in the room anymore. She was somewhere else. A crackle of static, a panicked voice trying to push through interference, a scream that wasn't supposed to happen, couldn't have happened, but did. A final sound that replayed in her chest every time she closed her eyes. Her brother's voice. The commander's words dragged her back. We need eyes on that village before dawn. Intel says movement is imminent. Civilians, possible leverage, timing unclear. His gaze flicked across the table, a sweep. It landed on her for the briefest second, acknowledgement or accident. She couldn't tell. Before she could draw meaning from it, his eyes slid past her again, settling on Alvarez, on Morris, on the voices that filled the silence she left behind. She didn't flinch, she didn't speak. She let the silence cover her like armor. Inside, though, her chest was tight. A tremor of memory pressed against her lungs. Her brother, his laugh, his music, the way he filled silence with noise because she never did. They had been opposites. He had been the voice, she had been the echo, until one day the voice stopped, and the silence became everything. The room erupted into argument again, routes, patrols, risks, debates about timing. She tapped her fingers against the folder, steady, a rhythm no one noticed. She was already building her own plan, not theirs, hers. When the briefing ended, chairs scraped back, boots thudded against the concrete floor, voices carried down the hall. She stayed seated a moment longer. Let them all go. Let them all move on, carrying their noise and certainty out into the night. Then she rose, quiet as breath, and stepped into the emptying corridor. The desert night greeted her, air hot, dry, stinging against her skin like grit. Above, the stars were sharp enough to cut. The world out here had no sound, no hum of fluorescent lights, no clutter of voices, just the endless stretch of silence. Her boots crunched softly over gravel as she made her way to the hangar. The shadowed frame of the building loomed, yawning open, holding darkness inside. She found her rifle leaning against the wall where she had left it, polished, oiled, scope covered. She ran her hand along the barrel, her fingers lingering on cool steel, feeling the weight of trust. This wasn't just a weapon. It was her voice, her language, the sound she made when silence no longer sufficed. She sat on the wooden bench nearby, the rifle resting across her knees, and let her gaze fall to the concrete floor. The silence of the hangar pressed against her ears until it almost hurt. And memory filled the quiet. Her brother had always been the loud one. He'd been the one with the music, singing badly on purpose, laughing at his own terrible jokes, talking too much at the worst times. He filled rooms with life. He filled silence with noise. He filled her world with sound she hadn't known she needed. And then one night he was gone. The mission report had told her what had happened, but she hadn't needed words. She had heard it herself. A crackle of radio static, his voice broken, desperate. Then a scream cut short. Then silence. That silence had lived inside her ever since. It shaped her, molded her. They thought her silence meant emptiness, absence, weakness. But they were wrong. Her silence was a wound that bled every time she breathed. Her silence was fire, burning low but endless. Her silence was weight, heavier than steel, stronger than stone. And she had carried it all the way here. Her hand tightened on the rifle. The word hostage burned in her ears. Civilians may be leverage, maybe bargaining chips, but to her they were more than tactical terms. They were reminders, reminders of what she had lost, reminders of why she stayed when everything in her had begged her to leave. Because there had been a promise. The night she'd buried his dog tags in the silence of an empty chapel, she had whispered it to herself. A vow no one else heard. That she would never let another voice be silenced the way his had. That she would take her silence and turn it into something that shielded others. Something that endured. That was why she wore the uniform. Not for medals, not for recognition, but for him. Outside, the desert wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of oil and dust. She rose from the bench, rifle in hand, and stepped toward the hangar doors. The mission would go on with or without her. They might not call her name in the briefing, might not see her at the table. But when the night pressed hardest, when the noise of others collapsed under reality, they would need her. They always did. And when that moment came, when silence broke, hers would roar louder than all of them. But there was something she hadn't told them, something she kept buried beneath layers of quiet. Not yet. The night stretched around her, infinite, suffocating. She lifted her eyes to the stars, their cold light scattering across black sky. She wondered for a fleeting moment if he was somewhere among them, laughing, singing, loud as ever. And then she lowered her gaze, steady and hard. Because morning was coming, and with it the mission. She stood alone, but what came next, no one expected. The horizon cracked with the first light of dawn. Pale gold washed across the desert, chasing shadows into brittle gullies and scattering long beams of light across jagged rock. The camp stirred awake, a shuffle of boots, muted conversations, the low whine of vehicles turning over. A bird wheeled overhead, its cry sharp against the morning silence. She laced her boots tighter, pulling the rough fabric snug around her ankle. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that came from ritual. Every tug, every knot, every strap secured was less about the boot and more about readiness. Preparation was the language she spoke when no one else would listen. The unit gathered by the vehicles, voices low but tense. Alvarez barked orders like punctuation. Morris grinned too wide, hiding nerves behind bravado. The young recruit, the one with too much eagerness, too little experience, shifted his weight back and forth, trying to look steady. They were a familiar rhythm, noise and chatter wrapped around purpose. And she stood slightly apart, her rifle resting against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the ridgeline already bathed in morning heat. They barely glanced at her, a nod maybe, nothing more. It should have stung. Years ago it would have. Back when she wanted to be seen, wanted her voice to cut into the room and shape the plan. Back when recognition felt like proof she belonged. But now it didn't matter. She wasn't there for their approval. She was there for something larger, something heavier. Something she couldn't put into words without her throat closing around memory. "Convoy ready in 2, Alvarez shouted. Engines rumbled to life. Dust kicked up, dry and bitter on the air. Soldiers adjusted their gear, tightening straps, clapping shoulders, making jokes to chase away fear. She climbed into the back of the lead truck, sliding onto the bench opposite the recruit. His helmet sat slightly crooked, sweat already beading at his temples. He tried to smile at her, a nervous flicker of teeth, before glancing away quickly as if unsure whether she would return it. She didn't. Instead, she studied him, the way his hands fidgeted with his rifle strap, the way his eyes darted between faces, looking for reassurance. He reminded her of someone not her brother but herself, long ago, before silence became her shield, before loss hollowed her out and left only steel in its place. The truck jolted forward. The convoy rolled out across the desert, tires grinding over gravel, engines humming steady. Sunlight spilled brighter across the horizon, burning away the last chill of night. Heat shimmered off metal, off stone, off the endless stretch of sand. Inside the truck, the air was thick with silence. Not her silence, not the heavy, deliberate kind. This was nervous silence. The kind that settled before something dangerous, something inevitable. She felt it in the way Morris bounced his leg too quickly, in the way Alvarez checked his weapon 3 times in 10 minutes, in the way the recruit's breathing quickened with every passing mile. She didn't add to their silence. She didn't break it either. She simply existed in it, calm, steady. Her mind, though, was far from calm. She pictured the village. The rough sketches from intel reports, the grainy images from overhead drones. A scattering of low stone huts, narrow alleys carved from dirt, the shadow of a single watchtower leaning into the sky. Somewhere in that village, hostages were being held. Somewhere inside, people were waiting, afraid, unseen, unheard. She thought of her brother again. Thought of the night his voice cut through static and was silenced forever. Thought of how helpless she had felt, unable to reach him, unable to stop what happened. And now, with every bump of the truck, every mile closer to that village, the vow in her chest burned hotter. She would not let silence take someone else. Not again. The convoy slowed. Engines lowered to a growl. Dust swirled thick in the air, settling on uniforms, stinging eyes. Alvarez raised his hand, signaling a halt. They had reached the ridge. From here, they would move on foot. Boots hit dirt, rifles slung forward, eyes scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endless, broken only by the faint smudge of the village in the distance. Heat shimmered off the ground, bending light, making the world waver like a mirage. Alvarez spoke quickly, dividing tasks, assigning roles. His voice cut sharp across the group. We approach slow, stay tight, keep eyes open. 2 on overwatch, rest of us sweep. Of course, he didn't look at her when he said overwatch. He looked at Morris, at someone else. But when the assignments scattered and soldiers began shifting into position, Morris hesitated. His scope wasn't tuned right. His rifle wasn't balanced for distance. He wasn't the one they really needed. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it. It was Alvarez who finally broke. "You," he said sharply, glancing at her for the first time all morning. "Ridge, North Sector, eyes on." "No, please. No, you're the best we've got." Just an order thrown like a stone. She nodded once, nothing more. And that was enough. She moved without sound, boots pressing carefully against dirt, shoulders low, rifle balanced against her chest. She scaled the ridge with the steady precision of someone who knew every step mattered. At the top, the world unfolded, the village below, small and fragile against the vast desert. Thin smoke curled from a single chimney. Dogs barked faintly, their voices carrying on the wind. A shadow moved in the alley, too quick, too sharp. She dropped to her stomach, rifle steady, scope raised. Through the glass, the village sharpened. Every doorway, every rooftop, every crack in the wall came alive in her eye. She scanned slowly, deliberately. A man leaning against a wall. A woman drawing water. Children darting through a narrow street, their laughter muted even at this distance. And then she saw them. 2 men, armed, standing too close to the central hut, their rifles held casual but ready. Their eyes moved often, scanning the street, the rooftops, the alleys, guarding. Her pulse steadied, her breathing slow. She shifted the scope slightly, inch by inch. And there in the darkness behind the hut's doorway, a flicker of movement. Small, quick, a shape ducking back into shadow. Hostages. She lowered her head, pressing her cheek into the dirt. A quiet exhale left her chest. She had found them. But she said nothing yet. Because she knew if she spoke too soon, they'd drown her voice in noise. Alvarez would bark, Morris would second-guess, the recruit would panic. They act before thinking. They'd risk everything. So she held the silence. She watched, waited, measured the rhythm of the guards' movements, the way they shifted their weight, the way they glanced down the street every few minutes. She counted heartbeats, seconds, breaths. And in the quiet, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It wasn't just duty. This was personal. This was her promise, her vow, her silence finally pushing toward sound. Behind her, faint on the wind, she heard footsteps, a soldier climbing the ridge. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The recruit. His breathing gave him away before he even reached her side. He dropped low beside her, clumsy, his rifle slipping slightly before he caught it. His hands shook. "See anything?" he whispered, voice cracking on the edges. She didn't answer right away. She kept her eye to the scope, steady, calm. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, firm, quiet but unshakable. "Yes." She didn't tell him what she saw, not yet, because silence, when wielded right, was more powerful than words. And somewhere inside, she knew, the moment she broke that silence, everything would change. Why did her chest tighten, as though the silence itself was warning her? The village lay below, deceptively still, bathed in pale desert light. From her vantage point on the ridge, every detail sharpened through her scope, a crack in plaster, the twitch of curtains, the faint shift of shadows. To anyone else it might have looked ordinary, harmless. But she saw what they didn't. She saw patterns. The way the armed men outside the central hut never strayed more than a few paces, circling like restless wolves. The absence of villagers in certain alleys, as if even daily life bent itself away from danger. The faint glimmer of metal inside a window that shouldn't have reflected light. It all spoke louder than words. Beside her, the recruit shifted. His breathing was uneven, his fingers clutched too tightly around his rifle. He was young, green, carrying the sharp tang of fear like sweat. He wanted to ask questions, she could feel them pressing against his lips, but he didn't. Maybe because of her silence, maybe because he didn't want to sound weak. She let him sit in it, let him learn the weight of quiet observation. Down below, the others spread into position. Alvarez at the center, barking low instructions into the comms. Morris moving quick, scanning angles but too restless, too loud in his movements. Others fanned out, their shapes blending into the desert brush. Her earpiece crackled. "Overwatch report." The call was sharp, expectant. She could have given them everything in a single breath, 2 guards, armed, positions stable, hostages inside. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she pressed her lips close to the mic, her voice low, controlled. Movement consistent. Hostiles outside central structure, unconfirmed shadows inside. It was enough to steady them, not enough to rush them. She chose her words like she chose her shots, with care, with patience. The recruit blinked at her, almost startled by the way her voice broke the silence. It was the first time he'd heard it. The comm crackled again. "Alvarez, copy, hold position." The recruit exhaled hard, as if he'd been holding his breath the whole time. "You sound calm," he whispered. His voice trembled at the edges. She kept her scope steady. "Calm keeps people alive." He nodded quickly, swallowing hard, as if tucking the words somewhere inside himself. Minutes bled into more minutes. The sun climbed higher, heat pressing down, shimmering against the sand. Sweat pooled under armor, slid down temples. Time stretched thin, taut as wire. Her scope never wavered. She followed the guard's rhythm, tracked their lazy arcs of movement, the way one rubbed his shoulder every few minutes, the way the other favored his left leg. Details, always details. Because details saved lives. Then a flicker. The curtain of the central hut shifted, just for a breath, just long enough for her to catch a face. Small, young, a child, eyes wide, staring out into sunlight before vanishing back into shadow. Her throat tightened. Hostages confirmed. Her finger tapped once against the rifle stock, a silent mark of certainty. Her earpiece buzzed again. Overwatch sitrep. She drew in a breath, let it out slow, and answered. Hostages confirmed. Multiple, central hut, guard rotation steady. The comms went silent for a moment. She imagined Alvarez's face tightening, the weight of choice settling heavy in his chest. Move now and risk chaos, or wait and risk relocation. Either way, lives hung in balance. The recruit swallowed audibly beside her. They're just kids, he whispered, as if saying it aloud could anchor the truth. She didn't answer. Because what was there to say? That children didn't belong in war zones. That innocence was always the first to be crushed under conflict. That every face she saw through her scope carried the echo of her brother, of promises she couldn't keep. Silence was safer. Down below, Alvarez finally gave the call. Advance slow, we sweep from east, keep tight, overwatch eyes sharp. The unit began their crawl forward, bodies low, rifles raised, steps deliberate. Dust puffed under boots, caught briefly in shafts of sunlight before dissolving. The village loomed closer, detail by detail, shadow by shadow. From the ridge she tracked every movement. Each ally, each hostile, each flicker of uncertainty. Her scope was both shield and burden. If she blinked, if she missed, someone would pay for it. The recruit lay beside her, trying to mimic her stillness, but his body betrayed him. Small tremors in his leg, shallow breaths he couldn't quite control. He was watching, learning, absorbing, and terrified. She remembered being him once, young, eager, waiting for someone to tell her she belonged. But no one had. Not until silence taught her to belong to herself. A shout cut the air below, sharp, angry. One of the guards had caught movement at the edge of the alley. He raised his rifle, barking words she couldn't hear but understood anyway. The unit froze. Through her scope she saw it all unfold. The guard squinting, uncertain. Alvarez holding his men in place with a clenched fist. The hostage child's face reappearing at the hut window, eyes wide with fear. Her finger slid against the trigger guard. She could end it. One shot. One clean crack of sound through silence and the guard would drop. But one shot would also shatter everything. Blow their cover, trigger chaos before the team was ready, risk the hostages. Her chest tightened. Her pulse pounded against her ribs. Every instinct screamed to act, to save, to make noise. But she held. Because silence was sometimes the only way to protect. The guard spat on the ground, muttered something to his partner, then turned away. The moment passed. Tension drained slowly, like water seeping into sand. She exhaled, only now realizing she had stopped breathing. Beside her, the recruit whispered, "Why didn't you take him?" Her scope stayed steady, because silence saved more lives than a bullet would have. He didn't reply. He just looked at her, eyes wide, as if seeing her differently for the first time. Below, the unit moved again, closer now, step by step. The village swallowed them slowly, stone walls rising, alleys tightening. The mission teetered on the edge of unseen consequences. And through it all she watched, silent, steady, ready. But deep inside, a storm churned. Because she knew silence could protect, silence could save, but silence could also betray. And when the moment came, when silence had to break, it would not be a whisper. It would be a roar. She didn't see the strike coming, not at first. It was the silence before that warned her, the way the desert wind stalled as if even the air knew what was about to happen. Then the first thud rattled the ground, followed by a bloom of dust and fire. Mortars. Her body reacted before her mind caught up, muscles pulling her down, cheek pressing into the grit of the earth. Around her, voices cracked into shouts. Radios flared. Someone screamed a name. And through the chaos, one thought slammed through her head. They've been watching us the whole time. But who had told them? Her heart pounded, not just from the explosions but from the gnawing suspicion that someone close had opened the door for this ambush. The convoy had shifted routes 3 times. Their comms had been secure, or so they thought. Yet the enemy was waiting with precision, like predators who had studied the herd. She crawled to cover, the metal husk of a burned-out truck shielding her from the next blast. Her hands shook as she slid her rifle forward, searching the ridgelines. The desert looked endless, but somewhere out there, between heat shimmer and rock, were the eyes locked on her. She exhaled, forcing stillness. Not weakness, stillness. The silence that made them doubt her all these years. It was the same silence that steadied her finger on the trigger now. A voice broke through the static of her headset. "We've got to move. They're pinning us down." It was Ortiz, the youngest of the squad. His voice cracked with fear he tried to bury, but she heard it. They all did. She glanced to her left, saw him crouched low, dirt streaking his cheeks, wide eyes darting between bursts of smoke. He was barely 22, still carried a photo of his high school sweetheart in the plastic sleeve of his vest. He wasn't ready for this. None of them truly were. But she couldn't let that show. Her gaze shifted to their captain, who was barking orders into the comms, jaw clenched, sweat cutting rivers down his dust-coated face. He pointed toward the northern ridge, a fallback point. She knew what it meant. Half of them might not make it there, maybe less. And then the sound she dreaded, the heavy whine of engines in the distance. Not theirs, enemy vehicles, reinforcements closing in. Her stomach tightened. They were outnumbered, outgunned. And every instinct told her the only reason they hadn't been slaughtered already was because the enemy wanted something more than blood. They wanted information, proof, a message. She bit down on her tongue, tasting iron. She remembered the words of her father, the one who had taught her patience, the one who had never raised his voice but commanded her whole world with quiet authority. Silence isn't absence. It's power waiting for its moment. This was her moment. She caught Ortiz's eyes. For a second he looked like a boy about to break. She gave him the smallest nod, sharp, deliberate. A silent promise, "You're not alone. Move when I move." He nodded back, clinging to that anchor. The next barrage tore into the ground behind them, showering them with shards of rock and metal. That was their window. She lunged from cover, sprinting low, every stride a gamble against the snipers she knew were watching. Her lungs burned. Dust filled her throat. Ortiz was at her side, boots pounding, breaths ragged. A crack split the air, then another. She dropped instinctively, shoulder slamming against the dirt. Ortiz stumbled but kept going. She wanted to shout, to warn him, but the words jammed in her throat. She raised her rifle, eyes slicing through the chaos, hunting the glint that betrayed the shooter. There. One controlled breath. One squeeze. The shot echoed sharper than the mortars. A figure tumbled from the rocks in the distance. Ortiz stumbled into cover, chest heaving, still alive. He looked at her with a kind of disbelief, like she had pulled him back from the edge of a cliff he didn't know he was falling from. But she felt no pride, just the weight of knowing she couldn't save them all. By the time they regrouped behind the ridge, their numbers were thinner. Faces she had seen at breakfast were gone now, replaced by smoke and memory. She pressed her back against the stone, wiping grit from her eyes. The captain was shouting into the radio, calling for extraction. His voice was steady, but she caught the flicker in his expression. He wasn't sure anyone was coming. That doubt lingered between them, all like poison. She sat in silence, rifle across her knees, eyes scanning the horizon. The others muttered, some cursed, some prayed under their breath. Ortiz fiddled with the photo in his vest, hands trembling too hard to tuck it away. She wanted to tell him to stop, to focus, but the words never left her lips, because she remembered doing the same once, clutching the photo of her brother the day before he deployed. The photo that came back folded in a letter instead of in his hands. She had never told them that part of her story. To them, she was just the quiet one, the one who never raised her voice at the table, never argued, never boasted. They mistook her silence for distance. But it was grief folded so deep into her chest that she feared if she opened her mouth too wide, it would spill out and drown them all. The captain crouched beside her, sweat glistening on his brow. "We hold here until evac. Stay sharp." She nodded, eyes never leaving the horizon. She didn't trust evac was coming. She didn't trust their position wasn't already compromised. And she didn't trust the silence in her own chest, the way it reminded her too much of the day she got that folded flag. A gust of wind carried the smell of burning fuel. Behind it, the faint sound of engines grew louder. She couldn't tell if it was friend or foe, neither could anyone else. Their radios crackled, then cut out, drowned in static. Comms jammed. Her pulse quickened. If it was enemy, they were done. If it was friendly, they had minutes to signal before the LZ was overrun. The captain signaled for flares. She dug into her pack, pulling one free. Her fingers hesitated on the pin. Every instinct screamed this was a trap, that revealing their position now would paint a target on their backs. She looked at Ortiz, at the others, at the faces streaked with fear and dirt. She thought of her brother, of the folded photo, of the flag. She pulled the pin. The red flare screamed into the sky, trailing fire. Every head turned upward. For a heartbeat, hope flickered in their eyes. Then the ridgeline erupted again, enemy fire raining down in answer. She didn't flinch, not this time. Her silence was gone, replaced by the roar of something deeper, the service that bound her to them, stronger than steel, stronger than fear. She chambered around, pressed her cheek against the stock, and whispered under her breath, not a prayer, not a curse, just a promise to herself. Not again. Not like last time. The engines drew closer. Friend or foe, they would know soon enough. And in that suspended breath, she realized something chilling. Someone here wasn't supposed to make it out. How long could a single flare burn before it either saved them or killed them? She watched its red tail hiss and arc above the ridge, staining the twilight sky like a wound. For a moment the squad stared at it as if it were something holy, as if salvation might descend on wings of steel at any second. But she knew better. Flares didn't summon angels. They summoned hunters. The engines grew louder, rising and falling against the canyon walls. Her gut twisted at every echo, trying to measure distance, direction. Was it an evac bird threading the valley, or the enemy's armored transports closing in? The sound was too fractured to tell. Ortiz crouched beside her, knuckles white against his rifle. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then finally, barely audible, he whispered, "It's ours, it's gotta be." She didn't answer. She couldn't lie to him. Her eyes cut to the captain. His jaw worked silently, calculating. He wanted to believe it too, but the doubt was etched across his weathered face. He glanced at her for just a second, as if he could sense that her silence wasn't passive, that she was weighing something he didn't dare say aloud. Then the ridge lit up again. Gunfire cracked down from the rocks. The squad scattered for cover, shouts tangled with the rattle of ricochets. Dirt sprayed across her cheek. Someone cursed, another screamed, then bit it back with a strangled groan. She pressed flat against the stone, breath shallow. And in that split second of stillness, she realized the truth. The flare hadn't been a beacon. It had been bait. The enemy was drawing them out, herding them like cattle toward the open ground below. The engines thundered closer now, no longer distant. She saw the dust plumes first, curling upward beyond the canyon mouth. Then the shapes, trucks, technicals, the silhouettes of men armed and waiting. Ortiz's voice broke beside her. "We're surrounded." The captain snapped into the radio again, even though the static drowned him. "Stay low, hold position." His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked with the tremor of a man fighting the weight of inevitability. She thought of her brother again, thought of the photo returned folded in grief, thought of the silence that had followed her since, the silence people mistook for weakness, when in truth, it was the only way she knew how to carry everything she'd lost. And in that moment, one thought rooted itself so deep it felt immovable. Not again. Not them. She looked at Ortiz, at the others, faces streaked in dirt and fear, each of them carrying a story they might never finish telling. A mother waiting at home, a letter unsent, a debt unpaid. The engines roared louder. The canyon was closing. She could hear her father's words again, whispered across time. Silence is power, but only if you decide when to break it. Her decision came like a fracture. She leaned close to Ortiz, voice low, almost a breath. They want us bunched. Don't give it to them. He blinked at her, startled. Then slowly he nodded. She crawled to the captain, tugging his sleeve. His eyes snapped to her, hard, impatient, but she didn't flinch. She spoke in clipped words, just enough to cut through the storm. Split, small groups, stagger movement, or we're done. For a second he hesitated, soldier instinct warring with command discipline. Then something in her expression shifted him. He gave a sharp nod. Move. The squad scattered, breaking into pairs, sliding across jagged stone and dry gullies. The enemy fire faltered for a beat, confused by the sudden fragmentation. Then it resumed, wild and searching. But the pattern was broken. The trap had teeth, but they no longer had the whole squad in its jaws. She moved with Ortiz, weaving between shadows, staying low. Her breaths came shallow, each inhale scouring her throat with dust. Her boots crunched against gravel, too loud in her own ears, though the chaos masked it. They ducked into a cut of rock, pressed against its cool face. For a moment the world narrowed to just the sound of her own pulse. Then Ortiz's whisper broke it. How did you know? She didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, thick as the air between them. Then finally, because I've been here before, not here, but the feeling, you don't forget it. Ortiz swallowed, eyes searching hers. He wanted to ask more, about what she'd seen, what she'd lost, but he didn't. He just nodded, as if her silence carried more weight than any story could. Gunfire rattled again, closer now. Voices shouted in a language she didn't know but understood well enough. Orders, positions, kill zones tightening. Her jaw clenched. They couldn't stay pinned here, not waiting for a vac that might never come. She pulled a smoke canister from her vest, thumb brushing its metal lip. Ortiz's eyes widened. You're not. But she was. She pulled the pin, rolled it into the open. A hiss, then a bloom of gray swallowing the canyon floor. Move. Her voice was sharp this time, cutting through everything. They sprinted through the haze, lungs burning with acrid bite. Shadows flickered inside the smoke, enemy fire cracking blind. She heard bullets whip past, close enough to feel their heat. Ortiz stumbled once, caught himself, kept going. They burst through the far edge of the smoke, collapsing into another cut of rock. Ortiz wheezed, coughing hard. She pressed her back to the stone, chest heaving, eyes scanning. Then she heard it, the chop of rotors slicing the sky. Her heart lurched, a helicopter, but was it theirs? Ortiz's head snapped up too, his face lit with something dangerously close to hope. It's a vac, has to be. She wasn't so sure. The sound grew, beating the air harder, closer. Shadows swept across the canyon walls. And then, through the haze, she saw it. The outline of a black hawk, blades carving dust into a storm. Her throat tightened. Relief surged sharp, fragile. Maybe they had a chance. But then, as the bird angled toward them, her eyes caught something wrong. Too smooth, too practiced. The way it hovered, holding back as if waiting. Her stomach dropped. She raised her rifle, squinting through the glare. And then she saw it, the emblem stenciled on its flank. Not theirs. Her blood turned cold. She turned to shout, but the roar of the rotors swallowed her voice. Figures leaned out from the sides, weapons glinting. Ortiz followed her gaze and his face crumbled. No. The trap wasn't just on the ground. It was in the sky. And in that suspended second, as enemy rounds lit up the canyon, she understood the cruel truth. Survival here wasn't about waiting for rescue. It was about refusing to be broken before the silence closed in for good. What do you do when the sound you prayed for turns out to be the sound that dooms you? The helicopter's shadow stretched long across the canyon floor, its blades chopping the sky into chaos. For a fleeting second, some of the squad had let themselves believe. Ortiz especially, his eyes wide with relief, lips trembling with the word home he never got to finish. But she had seen it first. The wrong markings, the wrong angle, a predator dressed like salvation. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She slammed Ortiz down, pinning him against the dirt just as the first stream of gunfire tore across the ridge. Rock splintered. Sand erupted. The Black Hawk wasn't here to save them. It was here to finish what the ground forces had started. The captain's voice cut through the storm. "Cover, now!" He shoved two of the squad deeper into a gully, returning fire with a precision born of years of impossible survival. But even he knew this wasn't just another firefight. This was a kill box. She pressed low beside Ortiz, her rifle tight against her shoulder. Every muscle burned with tension, but her hands were steady. Silence wrapped around her, not the suffocating kind, but the kind that sharpened every sound. The whip of rotor wash, the ping of rounds against stone, the frantic breaths of men trying not to die. And beneath it all, her thoughts whispered, they knew we'd call for help. Betrayal wasn't a bullet you could dodge. It was slower, heavier, sinking deep. Someone somewhere had sold them out. Maybe not in this squad, but close enough to know their roots, their flares, their desperation. She swallowed hard, forcing the thought down. Anger wouldn't keep them alive. Only clarity would. She spotted a gunner leaning out from the helicopter's side. His weapon swept the ground in arcs spitting fire. She tracked him, breath once squeezed. The rifle bucked and the gunner spun backward, vanishing into the smoke of the rotors. For a heartbeat, the firing slowed. Ortiz looked at her with something like awe. "You." "Move," she cut him off, pulling him toward a crack in the rock. No time for praise. No time for anything but the next breath. The squad shifted in fragments, each man a ghost darting between stone and shadow. The helicopter circled, blades carving the air into a storm. The canyon was alive with echoes, shouts, gunfire, the mechanical howl of a predator refusing to let go. She slid into cover beside the captain. His face was pale, streaked with sweat and grit. He didn't look at her, just kept firing, jaw tight. But she saw it, the doubt, the fracture beneath his command. He was running out of moves. So was she. Her chest ached with every inhale. The air was thick with smoke and sand, each breath clawing her lungs. She blinked against the sting, vision blurring at the edges. Somewhere behind them, one of the squad cried out, high, desperate. Then silence. A silence heavier than the storm around them. Ortiz flinched at the sound, but she didn't. She couldn't. If she let herself feel it now, she'd break. And she couldn't afford to break. Not yet. Her mind clawed for options. Their ammo was thinning. Their comms were dead. The canyon walls were too steep for a clean escape. Every path ended in a corner. Unless... Her eyes flicked upward. The ridgeline. Jagged, brutal, nearly impossible to scale under fire. But if one of them could get high enough, they might have a chance to mark a position, to signal something the enemy couldn't jam. It was suicide, but so was staying here. She wiped the grit from her cheek, pressing her lips together until the decision hardened. "I'm going," she said. The captain finally turned to her, disbelief etched into the lines of his face. "That's a death sentence." "So is waiting." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence in it carried more weight than shouting ever could. He stared at her, torn between authority and the quiet certainty in her eyes. Then slowly he gave the smallest nod. Not approval, not permission, just acknowledgement. She leaned toward Ortiz, who was shaking his head before she even spoke. "No, you're not. You'll cover me." His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked like he wanted to grab her, to hold her down, to stop her. But instead, his hands just clenched tighter around his rifle. His silence was an answer. She slipped from cover, pressing low, every nerve screaming. The helicopter's shadow swept across her, massive, merciless. She darted between jagged stones, boots skidding on loose gravel. Her breath came sharp, fast, but her mind forced rhythm into it. Inhale, exhale, step, push, don't stop. Bullets shredded the rock near her shoulder, showering her with fragments. She didn't flinch. She climbed, fingers clawing into cracks, boots scraping for purchase. The ridge loomed above, impossibly far, but she didn't look at the top. She looked only at the next handhold, the next ledge, the next breath. Behind her, Ortiz's rifle barked, covering her path. His shots weren't perfect, but they were desperate, and desperation was its own kind of precision. The captain's voice shouted orders, sharp and guttural, but she tuned it out. The world narrowed to the stone in front of her and the pounding in her chest. Halfway up, a round smashed into the rock beside her hand, sparking shards into her skin. Pain flared white-hot. She bit it back, jaw clenched, refusing to let go. Memories bled into the climb, her brother's laugh, her father's quiet words, the folded flag that still sat in a drawer she hadn't opened in years. Each one was weight, but also fuel. Every scar in her silence was strength now. She hauled herself higher, muscles screaming, lungs searing. The helicopter swung wide, rotors shredding the air. A spotlight flared, searing white across the ridge. She flattened against the stone, heart hammering, praying the shadow of the rock held. Seconds stretched into forever. Then the light swept past. She moved again, faster now, driven by the knowledge that hesitation was death. At last, fingers scraping raw, she pulled herself over the ridge. She collapsed flat against the ground, chest heaving, throat burning. The canyon sprawled beneath her, a storm of fire and dust. She saw the squad pinned below, shadows clinging to stone, fighting to survive against impossible odds. Her rifle lay heavy across her chest, but this wasn't about firing, not now. She pulled the last flare from her vest. Different from the others, blue, the kind meant to cut through jamming and chaos. A signal for emergencies so final they almost never came. Her thumb trembled on the pin. She thought of what would happen the second it ignited, that every enemy eye would snap to her, that she'd be silhouetted against the sky like a target begging to be erased. She thought of Ortiz, clutching that photo, of the captain's weary defiance, of the men below who still believed for one more second they might see home. Her silence broke, not in sound but in choice. She pulled the pin. The blue flare screamed upward, ripping the twilight apart. For an instant, the battlefield froze. Even the helicopter seemed to pause, its shadow hanging motionless. Every eye turned to the signal, to the impossible streak of color carving through smoke and dust. She lay flat, chest heaving, waiting for the answer, whether it would be salvation or fire raining down to erase her for daring to try. The silence stretched, unbearable, and in that stillness she understood the truth. Silence wasn't weakness. It was the roar that came before fate decided which way it would fall. The desert sky had begun its slow transformation again, painted with the bruised colors of another closing day. Elena stood at the highest ridge of the canyon, wind tugging at her fatigues, eyes locked on the horizon where smoke still curled from the ruins of the last stronghold they had taken. The air smelled of scorched earth and blood, even though the battlefield below had already fallen silent. Silence, it was heavier than the gunfire. It pressed against her lungs, reminding her that battles didn't always end when the shooting stopped. Sometimes, they ended only when the last memory of them faded, and she wasn't sure hers ever would. Behind her, the remnants of her unit were gathering what little gear they had left, patching wounds, burying friends. Out of 60, less than 20 stood. Every face was gaunt, every eye hollow as though the fight had stolen years from them in a matter of days. And yet they still looked to her. Not because she was the strongest, not because she was the most ruthless, but because Alina carried something they could not. She carried every sacrifice and every name. She clenched her fists at her side as the sun dipped lower, bleeding across the desert in sheets of crimson. Her steps carved slow lines through the dust, rivers flowing out behind her like trails of memory. Her footsteps carved rivers through the dust, flowing with sacrifice no words could hold. And those rivers were pulling her somewhere. She didn't know if it was toward the end of the war or toward the end of herself. "Ma'am," a voice rasped behind her. It was Ortiz, his arm in a makeshift sling, uniform shredded but still standing like a soldier. He approached carefully as though afraid she might shatter if he said the wrong thing. "Command just radioed in. They want us to push east at dawn." Alina closed her eyes. Dawn, another march, another trail of names that would never be spoken again. "They know we can't," she whispered. "Not like this." Ortiz swallowed hard, his face tightening. "They don't care. They think if we hold the canyon and move east, reinforcements might make it in time." Reinforcements. She almost laughed at the word. She had learned not to believe in them months ago. Reinforcements were stories commanders told from their safe bunkers to keep soldiers fighting when there was nothing left to fight with. Still, Ortiz's voice carried a flicker of hope, and maybe that was why he had come to her. "What do you want me to tell them?" he asked, his voice quiet, like a child asking permission to tell the truth. Alina opened her eyes and looked at him, and in his face she saw every soldier who had followed her this far. Broken, scarred, still waiting for someone to tell them that their pain had meaning. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Tell them we're not leaving our dead behind. Tell them we're not moving until every brother and sister is in the ground, not left for the vultures." Ortiz nodded slowly, understanding. He gave her a look, half respect, half sorrow, before moving back to the others. Alina turned her eyes back to the horizon. The last light of the day was slipping away, replaced by a cold wash of stars. Each one seemed to pulse brighter than usual tonight, like the universe itself was keeping count of the fallen. As the night deepened, they lit no fires. The survivors gathered in silence around shallow graves dug into the canyon floor. The sound of shovels against stone echoed in the darkness, steady and grim. Alina knelt at the edge of each grave, brushing the dust from the faces of soldiers she had led, whispering their names under her breath. She didn't care if anyone heard, the names had to be spoken. Martinez, Hana, Cole, Singh. Each one was a piece of her, each one cut deeper than the last. When she came to the final body, a young recruit named Anders who had barely been 18, she froze. His hand was still curled around the strap of his rifle, his face twisted in a look of surprise, as if he hadn't believed the end could come so fast. Her chest tightened. She set the rifle aside, smoothing his hair with one trembling hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You shouldn't have been here. None of you should have been here." But the night gave her no answer. Only the wind moved, stirring the sand, carrying the scent of death further into the desert. When the last grave was filled, the survivors stood in a line. No one spoke. There were no speeches left to give. Words had long since lost their power. Instead, they stood together in silence, eyes lifted to the stars. Alina closed hers. In her mind, she heard the voices of those they had buried, not as cries of anguish but as echoes of life, laughter in the barracks, jokes whispered in the field, quiet conversations under the fading glow of campfires. That was how she chose to remember them, not as bodies in the dirt, but as the reason she still breathed. And in that silence she made a vow. Not to the commanders who demanded more marches, not to the war that kept devouring them, but to the soldiers who had walked beside her, who had carved rivers of sacrifice through the dust with her. She vowed to carry their memory into whatever came next, even if it broke her. Hours later, Alina found herself sitting alone at the edge of the canyon, legs dangling over the stone. The desert stretched endlessly in front of her, dark and unforgiving, but her mind wandered elsewhere. She thought of home, not the house she grew up in, but the people she had lost along the way. Her mother, her brother, the friends who had vanished into this war before she even put on the uniform. She wondered if the sky remembered them too. The stars above seemed to whisper something, not words, but a presence. A reminder that sacrifice was never truly erased, that somewhere in the vastness of the universe, the fallen lived on. And maybe, just maybe, the sky would remember her too when her time came. She didn't fear death anymore. What she feared was being forgotten. And as long as she walked, as long as her footsteps carved rivers through the dust, no one she carried in her heart would ever be lost. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, thin and cold. The unit stirred, exhausted but alive, ready to march again. Alina stood, brushing the dust from her uniform. She looked at the graves one last time, pressing her hand against her chest as if to anchor the memory inside her ribcage. Then she turned toward the east, where command demanded they go. She didn't know if reinforcements would come. She didn't know if any of them would survive another march. But she knew this, the sky remembered, and so would she. And together, that would be enough to take one more step. Her footsteps carved rivers through the dust, and those rivers would flow until the story was complete. The morning rose not as a gentle beginning, but as a sharp command. The desert lit up in pale gold, sand stretching in endless waves that seemed almost to mock the weary band of survivors gathered in its shadow. Each one carried the weight of the graves they had left behind in the canyon, shallow cuts in the earth where their brothers and sisters now lay beneath the unforgiving silence. Alina stood at the front, her boots pressed against the edge of the ridge, eyes locked on the east. She had not slept. Sleep felt like a betrayal when so many lay still forever. The others waited for her to speak, but she had no grand words to give. She had long since abandoned speeches. What mattered was movement, one foot in front of the other. She adjusted the strap of her rifle across her back and finally turned to the faces staring at her. Scarred, bruised, starved of hope, and yet still alive. They were waiting for orders, but more than that, they were waiting for permission to believe that they hadn't survived this far for nothing. Her throat was dry when she spoke. We march east, not because command says so, not because anyone out there still believes in us, but because the ones who fell carried us this far, and we don't dishonor them by stopping now. The silence held her words like fragile glass. Then slowly, Ortiz gave a short nod, then another soldier, then another, until at last the broken band of 20 fell in line. And so the march began. The desert was cruel in daylight. Heat shimmered like fire on the horizon, blinding and merciless. Every step pressed into the sand felt heavier than the last. Their boots sank deep, dragging at their willpower, as if the earth itself wanted to consume them. Alina led without looking back. She didn't dare. She knew if she saw the exhaustion written across their faces, her heart might fracture under the weight of responsibility. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the horizon, her mind replaying the voices of the dead like a rhythm to keep her moving. Martinez's laugh, Singh's steady voice, Hana's soft humming during night watch. They walked with her, invisible but unbroken. Hours stretched, rations dwindled. The sun punished them without mercy. Alina's throat cracked with thirst, but she forced herself to keep her steps steady, to set a pace that others could cling to. If she faltered, the whole line would crumble. Her footsteps carved rivers through the dust. Every soldier followed those rivers, letting her will carry them when their own faltered. By midday, the desert began to shift. The dunes gave way to jagged stone outcrops, and in the distance, dark shapes loomed like scars against the earth. At first, Alina thought they were mirages, but as they drew closer, her breath caught in her chest. It wasn't a mirage. It was a fortress, not of their own making, but one built by the enemy. Black steel walls, high towers glinting in the sun, a wound carved deep into the desert floor. Smoke still rose from its far side, as if a recent battle had torn it apart. Ortiz came up beside her, panting heavily, his voice cracked with disbelief. That wasn't on the maps. Alina narrowed her eyes, scanning the structure. The silence around it was too heavy. No patrols, no movement, just the echo of something that had already passed. She felt it in her bones. This was no longer an enemy fortress. It was a graveyard. The unit hesitated behind her, whispers rising. Fear, suspicion. Alina raised her hand. Stay sharp, we move in slow. As they crossed into the ruins, the truth revealed itself. Bodies, not theirs, but enemy soldiers, littered the sand around the gates, their weapons rusting in the heat. The walls bore scorch marks, great black wounds where explosives had torn through the steel. Inside, the destruction was worse. Towers had collapsed, shattering into twisted metal. Vehicles lay overturned, their engines long dead. The air reeked of charred flesh and fuel. It was as if a storm had ripped through and left nothing but silence behind. The survivors moved cautiously, rifles raised, scanning every shadow, but no gunfire came. No ambush awaited them. Only echoes. Alina stepped deeper into the fortress, her boots crunching over shattered glass. And then she saw it, carved into the side of one crumbled wall, a message scrawled in blood. She stopped cold. The letters were shaky, uneven, but clear. We held the line so you could walk free. Her chest clenched. This wasn't just an enemy stronghold. Another unit had been here. Maybe allies, maybe strangers, soldiers who had fought the same war, who had died so others could live. The survivors gathered around the words. None spoke, but Alina saw it in their faces, a recognition, a mirror of their own struggle. Sacrifice wasn't theirs alone. The rivers of blood and dust stretched further than they had ever imagined. Alina pressed her palm against the words, letting the sting of dried blood burn against her skin. Then she whispered, "We remember." And in that moment she knew this place was not a tomb, it was a promise. They searched the ruins for supplies, finding scraps of rations, a few canteens of water, enough ammunition to fill their belts again. It wasn't much, but it was something. When they regrouped, Alina gathered them in the courtyard, where broken flags fluttered faintly in the hot wind. Her voice was steady, though her body ached. Whoever they were, they gave us this chance. We don't waste it. The soldiers stood taller. For the first time in weeks, Alina saw something flicker in their eyes. Not hope exactly, but resolve. A fire that refused to die. Night fell again, draping the ruins in shadows. They built no fires, but they sat together in the dark, the ruins shielding them from the worst of the desert wind. Alina leaned back against a slab of stone, staring at the stars above. They seemed brighter here, framed by the jagged walls of a fallen empire. She thought of the graves in the canyon, of the message on the wall, of the countless rivers of sacrifice flowing unseen across every battlefield. And she realized something. Her footsteps would one day fade. The dust would consume her just as it had consumed so many before. But the rivers she carved, the lives she carried, the names she spoke, the vows she kept, those would flow on. Not because she was extraordinary, not because she was stronger than anyone else, but because memory itself was unbreakable. The sky would remember. The earth would remember. And if even one survivor lived to speak the names, then sacrifice would never vanish. Alina closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling at her bones. For the first time in months, sleep came not as a thief but as a mercy. And in her dreams, she saw rivers, endless rivers flowing through the dust, carrying voices, carrying faces, carrying everything that had been lost into a place where nothing could erase them. At dawn they marched again, not toward command, not toward orders shouted down from safe bunkers. They marched toward survival, toward meaning, toward the horizon where others had fallen so they could walk free. Elena walked at the front, her shadow stretching long behind her, merging with the shadows of those who followed. Her footsteps carved rivers through the dust. And those rivers no longer belonged to her alone. They belonged to every soldier who had ever fallen, every name spoken, every vow kept. And so long as someone walked, so long as someone remembered, the rivers would never run dry. The dust would carry them into eternity. And history itself would whisper. She walked and we followed. She carried us and we endured. Her rivers flowed beyond the dust. Forever,